Have you ever left a conversation and immediately started replaying it in your head, word by word, wondering if you said the wrong thing? Have you ever laid in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, dissecting a 5-minute exchange with a coworker as if it were a crime scene? If you have, you already know how exhausting it is to live inside your own head, narrating every glance, every pause, every awkward silence, as though your entire worth depends on getting it right. This audiobook is not going to tell you to just relax or stop caring what people think. That advice never works, because the problem was never that you care too much. The problem is that your mind has learned a habit, a pattern of overanalyzing every social interaction until speaking to another human being feels like defusing a bomb. And habits, no matter how deeply wired, can be unlearned. What you are about to discover is not a collection of vague affirmations. It is a practical, psychology-backed system for understanding why your brain overthinks conversations, how that habit was built without your permission, and exactly how to dismantle it piece by piece until speaking confidently becomes your new default. You will learn why silence feels unbearable to you when it barely registers for other people. You will learn why your brain treats a stranger's raised eyebrow the same way it treats a genuine threat. You will learn how perfectionism secretly sabotages your ability to connect, how your identity itself may be built around being the anxious one in the room, and how to rebuild that identity from the ground up. By the end of this journey, overthinking will no longer run your conversations. You will. Chapter 1. Why your brain replays every conversation. Somewhere along the way, your brain decided that conversations were dangerous. Not dangerous in the way a car crash is dangerous, but dangerous in a slower, quieter way. The kind of danger that comes from being judged, rejected, or humiliated in front of other people. And once your brain decides something is dangerous, it does not let it go easily. It files the experience away and builds a system around making sure it never happens again. This is the root of why you replay conversations. It is not a character flaw. It is not weakness. It is your brain's threat detection system working exactly as it was designed to work, except it is aimed at the wrong target. Your ancestors lived in small tribes where being rejected by the group did not just hurt your feelings, it could get you killed. If the tribe turned against you, you lost access to food, protection, and survival itself. So the brain developed an extremely sensitive alarm system for social threat, one that treats a raised eyebrow or an awkward pause with almost the same urgency as a predator in the bushes. That alarm system has not updated itself for modern life. It still fires just as hard when a coworker gives you a strange look as it would if you were being physically threatened. This is why a single moment of perceived awkwardness can hijack your entire evening. Your brain is not being dramatic for no reason. It is running ancient software on modern hardware, and the mismatch is exactly what creates the loop of overthinking you experience after almost every conversation. Once the alarm goes off, your brain does something specific. It tries to solve the threat by analyzing it. This is why you cannot simply let a conversation go. Your mind believes that by replaying it over and over, it is protecting you from making the same mistake again. It thinks it is being helpful. It believes that if it reviews the tape enough times, it will find the exact moment where things went wrong. And once it finds that moment, you will finally be safe. But here is the cruel irony. This process almost never produces safety. It produces exhaustion. The more you replay a conversation, the more your brain treats it as significant. And the more significant it seems, the more anxious you become the next time you have to speak to someone. It becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. Overthinking does not prevent future awkwardness. It manufactures future anxiety. There is also a neurological piece to this that most people never learn. Every time you replay a conversation with a strong emotional charge, whether that charge is embarrassment, regret, or fear, you are strengthening the neural pathway associated with that emotion. Neurons that fire together wire together. So the very act of overthinking a conversation makes your brain more likely to overthink the next one, and the one after that, until the pattern becomes so automatic that it feels like part of who you are rather than something you learned. This is important because it means the goal is not to force yourself to stop thinking about a conversation through sheer willpower. Willpower rarely wins against a wired-in pattern. The goal is to interrupt the pattern at the source, to teach your brain, through repeated evidence, that conversations are not actually as dangerous as it believes them to be. There is one more piece of this puzzle that explains why some people overthink far more than others, and it comes down to something psychologists call intolerance of uncertainty. Some people are far more comfortable not knowing how something landed. They say something, move on, and simply trust that it was fine. Others cannot tolerate that unknown. Their brain demands certainty, and because certainty about how another person feels is almost never fully available, the mind keeps searching for it anyway, spinning in circles, trying to extract a guarantee from a situation that was never designed to offer one. If you are someone who overthinks conversations, you likely have a lower tolerance for this kind of social uncertainty, and that is not something to be ashamed of. It is simply information. It tells you exactly where the real work needs to happen. Not in trying to become someone who never makes mistakes in conversation, but in becoming someone who can sit with not knowing exactly how you landed and still feel okay. It helps to understand that this alarm system does not distinguish very well between a genuinely important social risk and a completely trivial one. To your nervous system, forgetting a coworker's name in the hallway can register with almost the same intensity as making a serious mistake in front of your boss. Because the system is not calibrated for nuance, it is calibrated for speed. It would rather sound the alarm 100 times unnecessarily than miss the one time the danger might have been real. Because, from an evolutionary standpoint, a false alarm cost almost nothing, while a missed real threat could cost your life. This trade-off made sense for a hunter-gatherer scanning the tree line for predators. It makes far less sense for a modern person trying to make small talk at a work event. Yet the underlying wiring has not changed nearly as quickly as the environment around it. This mismatch is also why overthinking tends to strike hardest with people who matter most to you, or in situations with the highest perceived stakes. A first date, a job interview, a conversation with someone whose opinion you deeply respect. The alarm system scales its intensity based on how much it believes you have to lose. And the more emotionally significant the relationship or the moment feels, the louder and more persistent the internal replay becomes afterward. This is not a coincidence, and it is not a sign that something is uniquely wrong with you in those situations. It is simply your threat detection system doing exactly what it evolved to do, protecting the connections it perceives as most valuable to your survival and belonging. Once you understand the replay loop for what it actually is, an outdated protective mechanism rather than an accurate signal of how badly things went, you can begin to relate to it differently. Instead of treating every replay as an urgent message that demands your full attention, you can start to recognize it as background noise, a smoke alarm going off because of burnt toast rather than an actual fire. You do not have to obey every alarm your brain sounds. You simply have to learn to recognize which alarms are worth listening to and which ones are simply old software running an outdated threat assessment on a situation that was never actually dangerous in the first place. Chapter 2. The Overthinking Trap. There is a specific mental trap that almost everyone who struggles with overthinking conversations falls into. And once you can see it clearly, you can never quite fall into it the same way again. The trap works like this. You have a conversation. Somewhere in that conversation, there is a moment. Maybe you paused too long before answering. Maybe you made a joke that did not land. Maybe you forgot someone's name. In the moment, this feels small. But the second the conversation ends, your mind pulls that one moment out of the entire interaction and places it under a microscope. Everything else that happened. The parts where you connected, where the other person laughed at something you said, where the conversation flowed naturally, gets discarded. Only the perceived mistake remains, magnified far beyond its actual size. This is called negative filtering, and it is one of the most common thinking patterns behind chronic overthinking. Your brain is not reviewing the conversation accurately. It is selectively editing it to confirm a story it already believes. Usually a story that says something like, "I am awkward. I always mess things up. People do not really like me." The mistake becomes evidence for that story, while everything that contradicts the story gets quietly deleted from the replay. This is why two people can walk away from the exact same conversation with completely different reactions. One person remembers the shared laughter and the interesting things they learned about each other. The other person remembers only the 3 seconds where they stumbled over a sentence. The conversation was identical. The filter applied to it afterward was not. Once negative filtering kicks in, a second trap activates, called mind reading. This is when you become absolutely convinced that you know what the other person thought of you, without any actual evidence. You did not ask them. You cannot read their mind. Yet, somehow you walk away certain that they thought you were boring, or weird, or too much. Mind reading feels like intuition. But it is not intuition at all. It is anxiety, wearing the costume of certainty. The truth is that most people are far too absorbed in their own internal monologue to be conducting a detailed audit of yours. Research on what psychologists call the spotlight effect has shown repeatedly that people dramatically overestimate how much others notice and remember about their behavior, because everyone assumes they are the main character being watched, when in reality almost everyone else is equally consumed with worrying about how they themselves are being perceived. The conversation you are agonizing over tonight is very likely something the other person has already forgotten. Not because you were forgettable, but because they were busy running their own internal replay about something they said. Once negative filtering and mind reading combine, they create a third and final trap, catastrophizing, where a small, awkward moment gets mentally inflated into a permanent judgment about your entire character. You do not just think, "That joke did not land." You think, "I embarrassed myself, and now they think I am weird, and this is going to affect how they see me forever." Notice the leap that just happened. A single moment became a permanent verdict. This is not logic. This is anxiety generating worst-case narratives and presenting them to you as fact. Breaking this trap does not require you to convince yourself that you are perfect in conversation or that mistakes do not matter. It requires something far more useful. Learning to notice the moment your brain starts selectively editing the story, catching the mind, reading the instant it happens, and asking yourself a simple but powerful question: what is the actual evidence for this? Versus, what is my anxiety assuming? Most of the time, when you genuinely search for evidence rather than assumption, you find there is very little supporting the catastrophic version of events, and quite a lot supporting a far more neutral, forgettable, ordinary interpretation of what happened. This single shift, learning to separate fact from anxious interpretation, is one of the most powerful tools you will ever develop for speaking with confidence, because it stops your mind from treating every imperfect moment as proof that you failed. There is a practical exercise worth understanding here, even though we will go deeper into applied tools later in this audiobook. When you notice yourself replaying a conversation and sliding into one of these three traps, negative filtering, mind reading, or catastrophizing, try mentally putting the moment on trial, the way a fair judge would, rather than the way an anxious prosecutor would. A fair judge does not accept assumptions as evidence. A fair judge asks, what actually happened? Versus, what story am I telling myself about what happened? If you genuinely separate the two, you will often find that what actually happened was something extremely minor. A half-second pause, a sentence that could have been phrased more smoothly, a joke that got a polite smile instead of a laugh, and that the elaborate story of humiliation and judgment was built almost entirely by your own mind, with very little actual evidence from the other person involved. This does not mean your feelings are not real. The discomfort you feel is completely real. But real feelings are not the same thing as accurate conclusions. You can feel embarrassed and still recognize that the embarrassment is not proof of the catastrophic story your mind is telling. Learning to hold both of these truths at once, the feeling is real, the story might not be, is one of the most liberating shifts available to anyone who overthinks conversations. It is also worth naming a fourth pattern that often works alongside the first three, called should statements. This is the voice in your head that says, I should have said something smarter. I should not have gotten nervous. I should be better at this by now. Should statements sound like motivation, but they function as punishment. They compare your real, human performance against an imaginary, flawless version of yourself that never actually existed, and then criticize you for falling short of a standard nobody could ever consistently meet. Every time you catch a should statement forming after a conversation, it is worth pausing and asking what you would say to a close friend who came to you describing the exact same moment. Most people are able to offer friends immediate compassion and perspective, reminding them that a small stumble is completely normal and forgettable, while reserving none of that same compassion for themselves. Redirecting that same kindness inward is not self-indulgence. It is simply accuracy. Treating yourself with the same fair, evidence-based standard you would naturally extend to anyone else you cared about. Chapter 3. The real reason you fear judgment. Most people assume their fear of being judged in conversation is simply about not wanting to look foolish. But if you dig deeper, the real fear is almost never about the moment itself. It is about what that moment supposedly reveals about you as a person. When you stumble over your words in front of someone, the fear is rarely just, "That was awkward." The fear underneath is closer to, "That proves I am not good enough. That proves something is wrong with me. That proves I do not belong here." This distinction matters enormously because it means the fear of judgment is not really about other people at all. It is about a belief you already hold about yourself. And conversations simply become the stage where that belief gets tested, over and over again. Psychologists call this core belief activation. Everyone carries certain deep, often unconscious beliefs about their own worth, formed early in life through countless small experiences. A parent who was hard to please, a moment of public embarrassment in school, a friend group where you always felt slightly on the outside. These experiences do not just fade away. They get encoded as beliefs. Things like, "I have to be perfect to be accepted," or, "If I make a mistake, people will see the real me and reject it." Once a belief like this is in place, your brain becomes hyper-alert for any evidence that might confirm it. An awkward pause in conversation is not just an awkward pause. It becomes potential proof of the very thing you fear most about yourself. This is why the fear of judgment can feel so disproportionate to the actual stakes of the conversation. You are not actually afraid of a coworker thinking you are quiet for one afternoon. You are afraid of confirming a story about yourself that you have been carrying for years, sometimes decades. Understanding this changes everything about how you approach the problem, because it means you cannot solve chronic overthinking simply by becoming a better conversationalist. You could master every social skill in existence and still overthink every interaction, because the techniques would be addressing the surface while the underlying belief remains untouched. The real work is in gently questioning that belief itself. Is it actually true that one awkward moment reveals your entire worth as a person? Is it true that everyone who has ever respected you would suddenly withdraw that respect over a stumbled sentence? When you say it out loud, stripped of the emotional charge, the belief usually sounds absurd, and yet in the heat of a real conversation, it feels like undeniable truth. That gap between how absurd the belief sounds in calm reflection and how convincing it feels in the moment is exactly where anxiety lives. There is also a physiological layer to this fear that is worth understanding, because it explains why logic alone rarely resolves it in the moment. When your brain perceives social threat, whether that threat is real or imagined, it activates the same fight or flight response your body would use for physical danger. Your heart rate increases, your muscles tense, your thinking narrows, because the body is preparing you to either fight the threat or flee from it, neither of which is particularly useful when the threat is a slightly awkward silence at a dinner party. This is why, in the middle of overthinking, you cannot simply reason your way out of it. Your body is flooded with stress chemicals that make calm, rational thought genuinely more difficult to access. This is not a personal failing, it is biology. The path forward involves two things working together: calming the physiological response through the body, which we will explore later in this audiobook, and slowly rewriting the underlying belief through repeated new evidence. Real conversations where you allow yourself to be imperfect and discover again and again that the world does not end. Every time you survive an awkward moment without it destroying your relationships or your reputation, you deposit a small piece of counter-evidence against that old belief. Confidence is not built by avoiding awkward moments. It is built by collecting proof one conversation at a time, that you can survive them completely intact. There is one more dimension to the fear of judgment worth exploring, and it involves the difference between actual rejection and imagined rejection. Real rejection, the kind that carries genuine consequences, is actually far rarer than the anxious mind assumes. Most people you interact with in daily life, co-workers, acquaintances, even strangers, are not sitting in harsh judgment of your every word because they are simply too busy managing their own internal world to dedicate that kind of attention to yours. When rejection does happen, and occasionally it will, because not every personality is compatible with every other personality. It is rarely because of one awkward sentence. It is almost always about a much broader mismatch in values, interests, or compatibility that has nothing to do with a single stumbled moment in a single conversation. Understanding this distinction matters because it means you can stop trying to prevent something that was never really about your delivery in the first place. You cannot perform your way into being liked by everyone, because likability is not primarily about performance. It is about authentic compatibility, and no amount of careful, anxious calculation in how you phrase your sentences will manufacture a connection that simply is not there, just as no imperfect sentence will destroy a connection that is genuinely solid. This reframe removes an enormous amount of pressure from every individual conversation because it shifts the goal away from flawless performance and toward honest expression. When you stop trying to control how every person perceives you and instead focus on communicating honestly, something interesting happens. The fear of judgment naturally begins to loosen its grip, not because you have stopped caring about how you come across, but because you have stopped believing that your worth is decided by a single interaction. There is also real value in simply naming this fear out loud to yourself in calm moments, away from the pressure of an actual conversation. Ask yourself directly, what is the worst realistic outcome if this conversation goes imperfectly? Not the catastrophic, imagined worst outcome, but the actual, realistic one. In almost every case, the honest answer is something mild and survivable. Someone thinks you seemed a little nervous. Someone does not remember the interaction particularly fondly. Someone simply moves on with their day exactly as they would have regardless. When you train yourself to consistently locate that realistic outcome instead of the catastrophic one, the entire emotional weight you assign to ordinary conversations begins to lighten, and that lightness is precisely what allows genuine confidence to emerge. Chapter 4. Breaking the perfectionism habit in how you speak. There is a quiet, almost invisible belief that drives an enormous amount of conversational overthinking, and it sounds something like this: if I cannot say it perfectly, I should not say it at all. This belief rarely announces itself directly. It hides inside hesitation, inside the extra few seconds you take before responding while you mentally draft and redraft your sentence, inside the moments you stay silent in a group conversation because you are still polishing the perfect thing to say while everyone else has already moved on to a new topic. Perfectionism in speaking feels like carefulness, like thoughtfulness, like simply wanting to communicate well. But underneath, it is often something much less helpful. It is fear wearing the mask of high standards. Here is the problem with perfectionism as a communication strategy. Conversation is not a written essay that can be edited before it is published. It is a live, unfolding, imperfect exchange between two nervous systems trying to connect in real time. Nobody who has ever felt truly connected to another person in a conversation was connecting with a flawlessly polished performance. They were connecting with a real, slightly messy, occasionally stumbling human being, because that is what makes a conversation feel human rather than rehearsed. When you chase perfection in your speech, you are not actually optimizing for connection. You are optimizing for the appearance of control. And those two things are not the same. In fact, they often work against each other. Think about the people in your own life who make you feel most comfortable talking to them. Chances are, they are not the ones who speak in flawless, polished sentences with zero hesitation. They are the ones who laugh at their own mix-ups, who say, "Wait, that came out wrong. Let me try that again," who seem completely unbothered by the occasional stumble. Their ease comes not from never making mistakes, but from not being afraid of the mistakes they do make. That ease is deeply attractive because it gives the other person permission to relax too. Perfectionism, on the other hand, is contagious in the opposite direction. When you are visibly tense and overly careful with every word, the person you are speaking with often unconsciously picks up on that tension, and the conversation itself becomes stiffer, more effortful, less enjoyable for both people. Your attempt to control the conversation by perfecting your speech often produces the exact outcome you are trying to avoid: an awkward, strained interaction. Breaking this habit does not mean lowering your standards or suddenly not caring how you come across. It means shifting what you are actually optimizing for. Instead of optimizing for flawless delivery, you optimize for presence, for actually listening to what the other person just said, instead of rehearsing your next line while they are still speaking. A useful mental reframe here is to think of conversation less like a performance you are being graded on and more like a game of catch. In a game of catch, the goal is not to throw the ball perfectly every single time. Sometimes it is a little off target. Sometimes the other person has to reach for it, and that is completely normal and expected. Nobody walks away from a game of catch feeling humiliated because one throw was slightly off. The goal is simply to keep the exchange going, to stay engaged, to adjust and respond to what comes back to you. Conversation works the same way. A slightly awkward sentence is simply an off-target throw, not a catastrophic failure. And the natural next step is not to spiral. It is to just keep playing. One practical tool for loosening the grip of perfectionism is to deliberately lower the stakes you have assigned to individual sentences. Right now, your mind is likely treating each thing you say as a permanent, unforgettable data point in how this person will judge you forever. In reality, the overwhelming majority of individual sentences in any conversation are completely forgotten within minutes by both people. What people remember is not the precise wording of what you said. It is the overall feeling of the interaction, whether they felt heard, whether they felt at ease, whether the exchange felt warm or cold. This means you have far more room to be imperfect than your anxious mind is currently allowing you to believe. And the sooner you start acting from that truth instead of from the myth of the perfect sentence, the sooner speaking will start to feel less like a performance and more like what it was always meant to be: a simple, human exchange. There is a particular kind of perfectionism worth calling out specifically, because it disguises itself as social awareness rather than fear, and that is the habit of mentally rehearsing entire conversations before they happen. Maybe you have done this before: an important phone call, or before walking into a party, silently scripting out what you are going to say, and even predicting how the other person will respond, so that you walk in feeling prepared. In small doses, a little preparation is completely reasonable. But when this rehearsal becomes extensive and constant, it actually works against you in a very specific way. Because real conversations never follow a script. The other person does not know the lines you have written for them. And the moment they say something unexpected, which happens constantly in real dialogue, your carefully rehearsed plan collapses and you are left scrambling, often more flustered than if you had simply walked in without a script at all. This is because heavy rehearsal trains your brain to expect a fixed outcome. And reality's job is to consistently violate fixed expectations. The antidote is not to abandon all preparation, it is to shift what you are preparing. Instead of scripting exact sentences, prepare a general direction, a topic you are interested in, a question you genuinely want to ask, an intention for how you want the interaction to feel. This kind of preparation gives you a helpful anchor without demanding that reality behave exactly as predicted, which means you stay flexible and present instead of derailed the moment something unexpected happens. Another important piece of breaking perfectionism involves how you handle the aftermath of an imperfect sentence in real time, not after the conversation is over, but in the actual moment it happens. Most people who struggle with perfectionism respond to a stumble by either overcorrecting, launching into a long, anxious explanation of what they actually meant, or by shutting down entirely, going quiet and withdrawn for the rest of the interaction. Both responses draw far more attention to the original stumble than the stumble itself ever would have on its own. The far more effective response, and one that takes practice to feel natural, is simply to continue. Acknowledge it briefly if it feels appropriate. A light laugh, a quick, that came out wrong, and then move forward without dwelling. This single skill, the ability to continue smoothly after an imperfect moment, instead of spiraling into overcorrection, is one of the most visible markers of genuine confidence, and it is a skill which means it can be practiced and strengthened just like any other, regardless of how foreign it currently feels. Chapter 5. Rewiring your identity from anxious to confident. Everything we have covered so far addresses the mechanics of overthinking, the thought patterns, the fears, the perfectionism. But there is a deeper layer underneath all of it that most people never address. And it is the story you have quietly built about who you are as a communicator. If you have overthought conversations for years, at some point that pattern stopped being something you simply do and started becoming something you believe you are. You do not just think, "I overthink conversations sometimes." You think, "I am an overthinker. I am socially anxious. I am just not a confident person." Notice the shift from behavior to identity. This shift is subtle but incredibly powerful, because once something becomes part of your identity, your brain works hard, often without your awareness, to keep your behavior consistent with that identity, even when the identity is one that causes you pain. This is why simply learning better conversation techniques often is not enough on its own to create lasting change. You can learn every strategy in this audiobook, but if your underlying identity still says, "I am the anxious one," part of you will unconsciously sabotage your own progress, because confident behavior feels foreign, even threatening, to a self-image built around being careful and uncertain. Psychologists refer to this as identity-based habit resistance, the tendency for people to unconsciously return to behaviors that match their self-concept, even after they have consciously decided to change. This is not a flaw in your willpower. It is simply how identity works, and understanding it is the key to finally breaking free of it. So how do you actually change an identity that may have been reinforced for years or even decades? The answer is not to try to convince yourself overnight that you are suddenly a supremely confident person, because your brain will reject that claim as obviously false. And rightly so, since there is no evidence yet to support it. Identity change does not happen through affirmation alone. It happens through accumulated evidence gathered from small, repeated actions. Each time you catch yourself overthinking and choose instead to speak up anyway, even imperfectly, you are casting a small vote for a new identity. Each time you sit with an awkward silence instead of rushing to fill it with anxious over-explanation, you are casting another vote. Each time you allow yourself to stumble over a sentence and keep going without collapsing into self-criticism, you are casting another vote. No single vote changes everything instantly, but identity is built the same way a body is built at the gym, through consistent repetition over time, not through a single dramatic transformation. One incredibly useful practice here is what could be called identity labeling in real time. Instead of thinking of confidence as some far-off destination you have not yet reached, start deliberately noticing and naming the moments when you already act with confidence, however small. Did you speak up in a meeting today even though your voice shook slightly? That was a confident action. Did you tell a joke that only got a mild laugh, and you kept talking anyway instead of shrinking? That was a confident action. The goal is to train your brain to notice this evidence instead of dismissing it. Because right now, if you are like most people who overthink conversations, you are almost certainly filtering out every piece of evidence that contradicts your anxious identity, while magnifying every piece that confirms it. Reversing that filter, deliberately, consciously, again and again, is how the identity itself eventually shifts. It is worth saying clearly that this process is not fast, and anyone who promises you an instant transformation is not being honest with you. But it is also worth saying clearly that it is absolutely reliable. The nervous system that currently treats conversation as a threat is the same nervous system capable of treating conversation as an opportunity. It simply needs new, consistent evidence to update its old programming. You are not trying to become a different person. You are trying to become the version of yourself that was always available underneath the years of protective overthinking. The version that speaks because they have something to say, not because they have calculated the perfect way to say it. That version of you does not require the anxiety to disappear completely before it can show up. It simply requires you to keep showing up, imperfectly, consistently, until showing up stops feeling like an act of courage and starts feeling like who you simply are. It is worth pausing here to notice something important about the 5 ideas we have covered so far. None of them asked you to eliminate anxiety completely, and none of them promise that overthinking will vanish overnight the moment you understand where it comes from. That would be a false promise. And false promises are exactly what keep people stuck, chasing a finish line that does not actually exist. What has actually happened so far is something quieter but far more durable. You now understand the mechanism behind the loop. You understand why your brain replays conversations, why it filters the evidence unfairly, why judgment feels so threatening, why perfectionism sabotages the very connection it is trying to protect, and why identity itself can keep pulling you back toward old patterns even after you consciously decide to change. This understanding alone will not make overthinking disappear, but it does something almost as important. It takes away the mystery. Overthinking stops feeling like some uncontrollable, mysterious flaw in your personality and starts feeling like exactly what it is: a predictable pattern with identifiable triggers and identifiable exits. That shift from mystery to mechanism is often the very first moment someone begins to feel a flicker of control they have not felt in years. From here forward, the goal becomes practical. It is one thing to understand why the loop exists. It is another thing entirely to build the specific tools that interrupt it in real time. In the middle of an actual conversation, when your heart is racing and your mind is already 3 steps ahead, trying to calculate the safest possible sentence, that is exactly where we go next. Moving from understanding the problem to building the specific, repeatable tools that let you stay present, speak honestly, and walk away from conversations without needing to replay a single second of them. Chapter 6. The Power of Presence. Almost everything we have covered so far has focused on what happens after a conversation. The replay, the filtering, the identity that gets reinforced by years of anxious analysis. But there is a tool so powerful that it can interrupt overthinking before it even has the chance to fully form. And that tool is presence. Presence simply means directing your full attention to what is actually happening right now in this exchange with this person, instead of splitting your attention between the current moment and an anxious internal monitor constantly evaluating how you are doing. Here is something most people never realize about overthinking during a live conversation. It is almost impossible to be genuinely present and anxiously self-monitoring at the exact same time, because both processes compete for the same limited resource, your attention. When you are fully absorbed in listening to what someone is telling you, truly curious about their words, their meaning, their experience, there is very little bandwidth left over for the anxious internal voice, asking whether you sound smart enough or whether your last sentence landed correctly. This is why the single most effective tool against conversational overthinking is not a clever mental trick or a rehearsed line. It is genuinely, actively listening to the other person instead of listening to yourself. Most people, without realizing it, spend a significant portion of every conversation only partially listening to the other person, because a large part of their attention is occupied with formulating what they are going to say next, or anxiously reviewing what they just said. This divided attention is exhausting. And ironically, it is also what makes conversations feel harder than they need to be, because you are essentially trying to run 2 demanding mental processes simultaneously, listening and self-evaluating, when the human brain performs far better when it commits fully to one. Active listening is not simply staying quiet while the other person talks. It is a specific, learnable skill that involves genuine curiosity about what they are saying, noticing details, asking follow-up questions that come from real interest rather than social obligation, and reflecting back what you have heard in a way that shows you have actually absorbed it. When you practice this kind of listening, something remarkable happens to your own anxiety. It quiets down, not because you have forced it to be quiet through willpower, but because your attention is genuinely occupied elsewhere, on someone other than yourself. There is a deeper benefit to this shift as well, one that goes beyond simply reducing your anxiety in the moment. When you listen with real curiosity, conversations naturally become easier to contribute to, because you are no longer scrambling to invent something interesting to say from scratch. You are simply responding to what is already right in front of you. The other person has already handed you dozens of potential directions the conversation could go. An offhand comment about their weekend, a passion they mentioned briefly, a challenge they are currently facing, and all you have to do is follow genuine curiosity toward any of these threads. This removes an enormous amount of pressure, because you stop needing to be endlessly clever or original. You simply need to be attentive. One practical way to build this skill is what could be called the follow-up habit. After someone shares something, rather than immediately shifting the conversation to a related story of your own, which is a common but subtle way people unconsciously make conversations about themselves. Try asking one genuine follow-up question first. This single habit does two things simultaneously. It deepens the connection because the other person feels genuinely heard, and it takes the pressure off you to constantly generate new material, because you are simply exploring what they have already given you. Presence is also physical, not just mental. Anxious overthinking tends to pull your body slightly out of the room. Your eyes drift, your posture tightens, your breathing becomes shallow and rapid. Bringing your body back into the conversation, relaxing your shoulders, taking a slower breath, softening your gaze rather than staring intensely or looking away, sends a signal not just to the other person, but back to your own nervous system that this moment is safe. The body and mind are deeply connected in both directions. Anxious thoughts create physical tension, but physical relaxation can also calm anxious thoughts. And this means presence is not something you have to achieve purely through mental effort. You can access it directly through the body as well, simply by consciously softening rather than bracing. There is a specific mental habit worth building deliberately, because it trains presence far more effectively than simply telling yourself to pay attention, and that habit is curiosity as a discipline rather than a personality trait. Many people assume that some individuals are naturally curious and others simply are not, as though curiosity were a fixed trait you either possess or lack. In reality, curiosity is closer to a muscle, one that weakens through disuse and strengthens through deliberate practice. When you walk into a conversation already anxious, your default mental state tends toward self-protection rather than exploration. And self-protection is fundamentally incompatible with curiosity, because curiosity requires a kind of openness that feels risky when you are bracing for judgment. Building curiosity as a discipline means consciously choosing, before and during a conversation, to orient your attention outward rather than inward, deliberately asking yourself, what is interesting about this person? What do I not yet know about what they just said? What would happen if I asked one layer deeper? This is not about performing interest you do not feel. It is about recognizing that nearly every person carries far more complexity and nuance than a first exchange reveals, and that complexity becomes visible only when you actually look for it. Presence also has a pacing component that is frequently overlooked. Anxious speakers often rush both their own words and their expectations of how quickly a conversation should develop meaning or connection. slowing your internal pace, allowing a beat before responding, allowing a topic to breathe instead of immediately pivoting to a new one, communicates a kind of ease that words alone cannot convey. This slower pacing is not a performance either. It emerges naturally once your attention is genuinely absorbed in listening rather than divided between listening and self-monitoring, which brings the entire chapter back to its central point. Presence is not a technique you apply on top of anxiety. It is the direct antidote to it, because the two states cannot fully coexist in the same moment of attention. It is also useful to understand why presence feels so difficult to access in the exact moments you need it most, during conversations that genuinely matter to you. The paradox is that the more you care about how a conversation goes, the more your mind tends to pull away from the present moment and into anxious forecasting, rehearsing what to say next or reviewing what was just said, precisely because the stakes feel elevated. This means presence is often hardest to access in the very conversations where it would be most valuable, which is exactly why it needs to be practiced deliberately in lower stakes settings first, ordinary conversations with cashiers, co-workers, or acquaintances, where the consequences of imperfect attention are genuinely negligible. Building the muscle of presence in these low-pressure environments creates a kind of accumulated skill that becomes available to you later in higher-stakes moments, not because the anxiety in those higher-stakes moments disappears, but because your capacity to redirect attention back to the present, even amid some residual anxiety, has already been strengthened through repetition elsewhere. This is an important reframe, because it means you do not need to wait until you feel calm to begin practicing presence. You can practice it specifically in the small, unremarkable conversations that fill most ordinary days, and that practice quietly compounds, showing up exactly when you need it most, in the conversations that once felt entirely governed by anxiety alone. Chapter 7. Handling silence and awkward pauses without panic. For many people who overthink conversations, few things feel more threatening than silence. A pause of even 2 or 3 seconds can feel unbearable, triggering an almost desperate urge to fill the space with words, any words, just to make the discomfort stop. Understanding why silence feels so threatening and learning to tolerate it is one of the most transformative shifts available to anyone working on conversational confidence. The fear of silence usually comes from an unspoken belief that silence means something has gone wrong, that the conversation has failed, that the other person is bored or judging you for running out of things to say. But this belief, when examined honestly, does not hold up particularly well. Silence is a completely normal, natural part of human conversation. It happens constantly between people who are perfectly comfortable with each other. Close friends, long-term partners, family members. In fact, the ability to sit comfortably in silence with another person is often a marker of genuine closeness, not distance, because it signals that neither person feels obligated to perform constant chatter in order to justify the interaction. The discomfort you feel during a pause is almost always far more intense on your side than it registers on the other person's side. Research on conversational timing has repeatedly shown that people tend to overestimate how uncomfortable a silence actually felt to the other participant, largely because the anxious person is hyper-aware of every second, while the other person is simply thinking, processing, or comfortably present without any internal alarm going off at all. This means The silence you experience as unbearable may not even register as noteworthy to the person sitting across from you. Learning to tolerate silence begins with reframing what a pause actually represents. Instead of interpreting silence as a sign of failure, you can train yourself to interpret it as simply a natural rhythm, a breath between thoughts, a moment where either person is processing what was just said. Conversations that never have any pauses at all often feel rushed, performative, or even exhausting, because there is no room for genuine reflection. A little silence actually signals depth. It suggests that what was said mattered enough to think about, rather than immediately rushing past it toward the next topic. One practical technique for handling silence without panic is to consciously slow down your internal countdown. Most people who fear silence have an internal clock that starts counting the instant a pause begins. 1, 2, panic. And by the time 3 seconds have passed, the anxious mind has already convinced itself that something has gone catastrophically wrong. If you can consciously extend your own tolerance, simply reminding yourself that 5, even 10 seconds of silence is completely normal in a real conversation, you buy yourself the space to respond thoughtfully, rather than blurting out the first anxious thing that comes to mind, just to escape the discomfort. Another useful reframe is to think of silence as shared, rather than yours alone to fix. Many overthinkers unconsciously take on the entire responsibility for keeping a conversation moving, as though any pause is a personal failure they alone must resolve. But conversation is a two-person activity, and silence belongs to both people equally. You are not solely responsible for filling every gap, and releasing that self-imposed responsibility often reduces a significant portion of the pressure that makes silence feel so unbearable in the first place. If you do feel the need to break a silence, there is no requirement that you fill it with something clever or impressive. A simple, genuine observation, or even naming the pause itself with light humor, something like, "Well, we've covered a lot," can work perfectly well, because what breaks the tension is not the brilliance of the words. It is simply the return of natural, relaxed engagement. It is worth noting that different types of silence carry different meanings, and learning to distinguish between them removes a significant amount of unnecessary anxiety. A silence that follows a genuine, substantive statement, something emotionally meaningful or thought-provoking, is often a sign of reflection. The other person is actually considering what you said, which is a compliment to the depth of the exchange rather than evidence that something has gone wrong. A silence that follows a joke that did not land is a different, smaller kind of pause. And even this kind of silence rarely carries the weight the anxious mind assigns to it, since most people forget an unlanded joke within seconds and move on without a second thought. A silence born from simple comfort. Two people who have run out of an immediate topic but are still enjoying each other's company is perhaps the most misunderstood of all, because it is often the closest thing to true relational ease that exists, and yet it is precisely the kind of silence that overthinkers rush hardest to fill, mistaking comfort for its opposite. Learning to identify which type of silence you are actually in, rather than defaulting to the worst-case interpretation every time, is a skill that develops with practice and attention. Another helpful practice involves physically anchoring yourself during a pause rather than mentally scrambling for words. Instead of using a silence as a cue to frantically search for something to say, try using it as a cue to simply breathe, to relax your shoulders, to make gentle eye contact if that feels comfortable, or to genuinely enjoy a sip of a drink if one is nearby. This physical grounding accomplishes two things at once. It visibly signals ease to the other person, since your body language communicates far more than your words during a quiet moment, and it interrupts the internal panic spiral before it has the chance to fully build momentum. Over time, repeated practice with tolerating silence rather than avoiding it retrains your nervous system to stop treating quiet moments as emergencies. And that retraining is cumulative, meaning each time you sit through a pause without panicking, the next pause becomes measurably easier to sit through as well. Chapter 8. Mastering small talk without feeling fake. Small talk gets an unfair reputation, often dismissed as shallow or meaningless. Yet for many overthinkers, it is precisely where the most anxiety concentrates, because small talk lacks a clear structure or purpose, which leaves the anxious mind scrambling to invent one. Understanding what small talk actually accomplishes beneath its surface-level content changes how approachable it feels. Small talk is not really about the weather or the traffic or the weekend plans being discussed. Those topics are simply low-stakes vehicles for something far more important: establishing safety and rapport between two people before any deeper connection becomes possible. Every relationship, whether professional or personal, tends to move through small talk first, because small talk allows both people to calibrate tone, warmth, and mutual interest without the pressure of immediately diving into anything vulnerable or complex. Once you understand this underlying function, small talk stops feeling like a pointless obstacle and starts feeling like exactly what it is: a low-pressure warm-up that makes everything deeper possible afterward. One of the biggest reasons small talk feels exhausting to overthinkers is the belief that every exchange needs to be interesting or impressive in order to be worthwhile. This belief creates enormous pressure over what should be an extremely low-stakes interaction. In reality, the goal of small talk is not to impress anyone. It is simply to create a small, pleasant moment of connection. And pleasant moments do not require brilliance. They require warmth, curiosity, and genuine presence, the same qualities we explored in the chapter on presence. A useful mental shift here is to stop thinking of small talk as a test you need to pass, and start thinking of it as a simple exchange of small gifts: a comment here, a question there, each one a small offering rather than a performance being graded. There are practical structures that make small talk significantly easier to navigate without needing to overthink every exchange. One reliable approach involves noticing something in the shared environment or situation and using it as a natural entry point. A comment about the event you are both attending, the food being served, the unusually long line you are both standing in. These shared circumstantial details require no creativity to notice. They are simply present, and using them as conversation starters removes the pressure of trying to invent something clever from nothing. From there, open-ended questions, ones that cannot be answered with a single word, naturally extend the exchange without requiring you to carry the entire conversation alone. Asking someone what brought them to an event or what they have been working on lately invites a fuller response than a closed question ever could, and that fuller response, almost always, contains multiple threads you can follow with genuine curiosity, which returns us directly to the listening skills covered earlier. It also helps enormously to release the pressure of needing every small talk interaction to go somewhere significant. Not every conversation is meant to become a deep friendship, and that is completely fine. Some interactions are simply meant to be pleasant, brief, forgettable exchanges. And there is nothing wrong with an exchange being forgettable. Most human interactions are, including the ones other people have with you. Expecting every conversation to be meaningful or memorable is an unrealistic standard that no one, including the most naturally confident people you know, actually meets. And releasing that unrealistic expectation is often what finally allows small talk to feel light rather than heavy. There is also a common misconception that naturally confident people simply never find small talk tedious or effortful, and this misconception can make overthinkers feel even more isolated in their struggle, believing something is uniquely wrong with them for finding light conversation draining. In reality, many people who appear effortlessly skilled at small talk have simply built enough repetition with low-stakes exchanges that the process has become automatic, requiring far less conscious effort than it once did. What looks like natural talent is very often simply accumulated practice. And this distinction matters because it means the skill is available to you as well, through the same repetition rather than being reserved for some fixed personality type you either belong to or do not. It also helps to recognize that small talk has a natural arc, a beginning, a middle, and a graceful exit, and much of the anxiety people feel around it comes from uncertainty about how to end an exchange rather than how to start or sustain one. A simple, warm closing statement, something acknowledging enjoyment of the conversation or a practical reason to move on, is entirely sufficient and does not require an elaborate explanation or apology. Overthinkers often linger in small talk longer than necessary, worried that ending the conversation too soon will seem rude, when in reality a clean, friendly exit is almost always received better than a conversation that drags on past its natural energy simply because neither person felt permitted to close it. Building comfort with small talk, ultimately, is not about becoming a different kind of person. It is about lowering the artificially high stakes you have attached to an inherently low-stakes activity and allowing yourself to treat these brief exchanges exactly as what they are. Small, pleasant, forgettable moments of shared humanity that require warmth far more than they require brilliance. It also helps to notice that small talk often serves as a filter rather than an obstacle, quietly revealing who, among the many people you encounter, might be worth pursuing a deeper connection with. Not every small talk interaction is meant to blossom into something more, and that is not a shortcoming of the exchange. It is simply how social filtering naturally works, through many brief, low-stakes touches rather than one high-pressure attempt to determine compatibility instantly. Approaching small talk with this understanding removes yet another layer of unnecessary pressure, because you are no longer trying to force every interaction towards significance. You are simply staying open, pleasant, and present, and allowing the handful of genuinely compatible connections to reveal themselves naturally over time, the same way they do for everyone else, regardless of how naturally confident they may appear. Chapter 9. Assertiveness. Saying what you mean without fear. Overthinking conversations often comes paired with a specific and closely related struggle. Difficulty saying what you actually think or want, out of fear that it might upset someone, create conflict, or make you seem difficult. This pattern is called passive communication, and it is extremely common among people who have spent years over-analyzing how they come across to others. Passive communication involves consistently prioritizing the comfort of the people around you over your own honest expression. Agreeing when you actually disagree. Saying yes when you mean no. Softening your genuine opinions until they barely resemble what you actually think. In the short term, passive communication feels safer because it avoids the immediate discomfort of potential disagreement or tension. But over time, it creates a much larger cost. A growing sense that people around you do not actually know the real you, because you have spent so much energy managing their perception that your authentic thoughts rarely make it into the conversation at all. The alternative to passive communication is not aggressive communication, forcing your opinions onto others without regard for their feelings, which creates an entirely different set of problems. The healthy middle path is assertiveness, the ability to express your honest thoughts, needs, and boundaries clearly and respectfully, without either steamrolling the other person or erasing yourself in the process. Assertiveness rests on a simple but often overlooked truth. You can disagree with someone or want something different than they want without it being a threat to the relationship. Most relationships, whether personal or professional, are far more resilient than the anxious mind assumes, and the discomfort of a single honest disagreement is almost always smaller and shorter-lived than the anxious mind predicts it will be. One practical tool for building assertiveness is learning to separate the content of what you want to say from the anxious performance around saying it. Overthinkers often spend so much energy softening, qualifying, and apologizing for their opinions that the actual message gets buried underneath layers of hedging. Phrases like, "This might be a bad idea, but," or "I'm probably wrong, but," which train the listener to take your input less seriously before you have even finished the sentence. Practicing stating your actual thought first, clearly, and only adding warmth or context afterward if needed, rather than burying the point beneath excessive qualification, allows your voice to come through with far more clarity and, counterintuitively, far more warmth, because clarity itself often reads as confidence rather than coldness. Assertiveness also requires a willingness to tolerate the other person's reaction without immediately trying to manage or fix it. If you express a genuine opinion and the other person seems slightly surprised or briefly disagrees, the instinct for many overthinkers is to immediately backtrack, apologize, or soften the original statement into non-existence. But a brief moment of tension following an honest statement is not evidence that something has gone wrong. It is simply two people processing a real difference of perspective, and processing that difference without either person collapsing or attacking is exactly what healthy communication actually looks like. Learning to sit with that brief discomfort, rather than immediately smoothing it over, is often the single biggest turning point between someone who constantly overthinks their words and someone who speaks with genuine, grounded confidence. Assertiveness also has an important boundary-setting component that deserves specific attention, because boundaries are one of the areas where overthinkers most commonly default to passive communication, often at significant personal cost. A boundary is simply a clear statement of what you are and are not willing to accept, whether that involves your time, your energy, or how others are permitted to treat you. Many overthinkers avoid setting boundaries entirely because the anticipated conflict feels far more threatening than whatever discomfort the boundary itself is meant to prevent, and so they repeatedly absorb situations that drain or frustrate them, rather than risk the brief tension of speaking up. Over time, this pattern tends to produce a quiet resentment. Since unspoken boundaries do not disappear, they simply accumulate beneath the surface, often surfacing eventually as irritability or withdrawal, rather than as the clear, direct communication that could have prevented the build-up in the first place. Learning to state a boundary clearly and calmly, without over-explaining or apologizing excessively for having needs at all, is a skill that directly parallels everything covered elsewhere in this audiobook. It requires tolerating a small amount of discomfort in the moment in exchange for a much larger, long-term gain in both self-respect and relational honesty. It is also worth addressing a common fear that keeps many overthinkers from practicing assertiveness at all. The fear that being direct will make them seem cold, harsh, or unlikable. In practice, the opposite is far more often true. People generally respond well to clarity, because clarity removes the exhausting work of trying to interpret vague, hedged, or indirect communication. And most people, even if they do not consciously recognize it, find directness relieving rather than off-putting, provided it is delivered with basic warmth and respect. The goal of assertiveness was never to become blunt or uncaring. It is simply to close the gap between what you actually think and what you actually say, so that the people around you are relating to the real you rather than a carefully managed, anxiety-filtered version of you that exists mainly to avoid discomfort. There is one final piece of assertiveness worth naming, because it often determines whether the skill actually sticks or quietly fades after a few attempts. And that piece is consistency across relationships rather than assertiveness that only appears in low-stakes situations. It is relatively easy to practice directness with a stranger you will never see again, since there is little relational cost if the interaction feels slightly awkward. It is far harder and far more important to bring that same clarity into relationships where the stakes feel higher: a close friendship, a family relationship, a long-term partnership, precisely because these are the relationships where years of passive communication have often become most deeply entrenched. Many overthinkers unconsciously believe that the people closest to them are the ones least able to handle their honest opinions, when in reality, the opposite is usually true. Close relationships are generally the most resilient ones, built on enough trust and history to absorb an honest disagreement without fracturing. Practicing assertiveness, specifically within your closest relationships, rather than reserving it only for safer, more distant interactions, is often where the deepest transformation actually happens, because these are the relationships where being fully known matters most. And being fully known requires, by definition, actually showing up as yourself rather than as a carefully managed performance designed to avoid any possible friction. Chapter 10. Recovering gracefully from social mistakes. No matter how much progress you make with everything covered in this audiobook so far, you will still, occasionally, say the wrong thing. You will trip over a sentence, forget a name, tell a joke that lands with silence instead of laughter, or realize a moment too late that a comment came across differently than you intended. This is not a sign that your progress has failed. It is simply what it means to be a human being, engaged in the unpredictable, unscripted activity of live conversation. What separates people who move through these moments with confidence from people who spiral into hours of overthinking is not the absence of mistakes. It is the presence of a specific, learnable skill, the ability to recover gracefully in real time. Graceful recovery begins with something that sounds almost too simple to matter, but is actually one of the most powerful tools available: refusing to over-apologize. When something goes slightly wrong in conversation, the anxious instinct is often to apologize repeatedly, drawing extended attention to the mistake and, paradoxically, making it feel far larger and more significant to the other person than it would have otherwise. A single, brief acknowledgement, if any acknowledgement is even necessary at all, is almost always sufficient. Excessive apologizing signals to the other person that this moment requires far more concern than it actually does, essentially teaching them to view a minor stumble as a bigger deal than they would have naturally assumed on their own. The most confident response to a small mistake is often the simplest one: a light laugh, a brief correction if needed, and then continuing forward exactly as you would have if the mistake had not happened at all. This forward momentum communicates something powerful without any words at all. It communicates that the mistake was not significant enough to derail you, and other people take their emotional cues from exactly this kind of modeling. If you treat the moment as minor, they generally will too. There is also enormous value in developing what could be called self-compassionate humor. The ability to laugh gently at your own occasional missteps without using that humor as a form of self-attack. There is a meaningful difference between saying, "Wow, I'm such an idiot," which reinforces a harsh, punishing internal narrative, and simply laughing and saying, "Well, that came out weird," which acknowledges the moment lightly, without attaching any deeper judgment about your worth or competence to it. This distinction might sound subtle, but the language you use toward yourself in these moments, even silently in your own mind, actively shapes how quickly you recover and how much residual anxiety carries forward into the rest of the conversation and beyond it. Perhaps the most important recovery skill of all is learning to let the moment end when the conversation itself has moved on. Once the interaction has continued, once the other person has responded and the conversation has shifted forward, the mistake, from their perspective, is already in the past. Continuing to mentally dwell on it after the conversation has clearly moved past it does not protect you from anything. It simply extends discomfort that has already served its purpose. Recognizing the natural end point of a moment and consciously choosing to let it close rather than reopening it internally for the rest of the day is a practiced skill, not an automatic one, and like every skill covered in this audiobook, it strengthens specifically through repetition, through choosing again and again to release what the conversation itself has already released, until doing so finally starts to feel less like effort and simply like how you naturally move through the world. There is one more layer to graceful recovery worth exploring, and it involves how you handle mistakes that genuinely do carry some real weight. Situations where you said something that actually did land poorly or unintentionally hurt someone, rather than the far more common category of minor, essentially inconsequential stumbles. In these slightly heavier moments, the same core principles still apply, but with one important addition: a sincere, direct acknowledgement rather than an anxious, repeated one. A brief, genuine, "I did not mean it that way. I'm sorry," delivered once, calmly, communicates far more accountability and far more confidence than an extended, nervous over-explanation that circles the same apology 5 different ways. Real accountability is clean and direct, while anxious over-apologizing, even when well-intentioned, often reads as an attempt to manage the other person's emotional response, rather than genuinely taking responsibility for your own words. This distinction matters because many overthinkers, out of a genuine desire to make things right, end up doing the opposite, prolonging a moment of tension that the other person was actually ready to move past far sooner than the extended apology allowed. It is also worth acknowledging directly that not every social interaction will go well, no matter how much you grow, and that this is not a sign that your progress has stalled. Some people you meet will simply not be a good match for your personality. Some jokes will not land, regardless of how skillfully you tell them. Some days your energy will be lower, and conversations will feel more effortful than usual. None of this represents failure. It represents the ordinary, unavoidable texture of being a real person engaged in real relationships, rather than a flawless performer engaged in a flawless script. The goal was never to reach a state where every conversation goes perfectly. That state does not exist for anyone, including the most confident, socially skilled people you know. The goal was always to build a relationship with yourself that can withstand an imperfect conversation without collapsing into hours of anxious replay. And if you have absorbed even a portion of what has been covered so far, that relationship is already stronger than it was when this audiobook began. Whether or not you can fully feel that shift yet, confidence, in the end, was never about becoming someone who never stumbles. It was always about becoming someone who can stumble, recover, and keep speaking anyway. Because that, more than any perfectly delivered sentence, is what genuine confidence actually looks like in practice. Chapter 11. Body language. Projecting confidence before you speak. Long before a single word leaves your mouth, your body has already begun communicating. Posture, eye contact, the pace of your movements, the openness or tightness of your shoulders. All of this forms an impression that lands before your actual sentences even arrive. And understanding this changes how you can approach confidence from an entirely new angle, one that does not require you to have the perfect words ready at all. Most overthinkers pour nearly all of their energy into managing what they are going to say, while almost entirely neglecting how their body is communicating in the meantime. And this is a significant missed opportunity, because body language is not simply a reflection of internal confidence, it is also a direct input into it. This relationship works in both directions. Your emotional state shapes your posture, but research on what is often called embodied cognition has shown that your posture can also shape your emotional state, meaning you are not simply a passenger waiting for confidence to arrive before you can stand tall. You can influence the internal experience by deliberately adjusting the external expression first. This does not mean faking an emotion you do not feel in some hollow, performative way. It means recognizing that the body and mind are in constant conversation with each other, and that conversation can be initiated from either direction. One of the simplest and most immediate shifts available to you involves posture itself. Anxiety tends to physically contract the body. Shoulders round forward, chest caves slightly inward, the head tilts down, all instinctive, protective movements inherited from a nervous system trying to make itself smaller and less noticeable in the presence of perceived threat. Confidence, by contrast, tends to physically expand. Shoulders relax and open. The spine lengthens slightly. The chin remains level rather than dropped. You do not need to wait until you feel confident to adopt this posture. You can adopt the posture first, deliberately, and allow the internal state to begin catching up, which it very often does, because your nervous system is constantly reading cues from your own body as evidence for how it should feel. Eye contact deserves particular attention here, because it is one of the most commonly misunderstood elements of confident body language. Many overthinkers believe that strong eye contact means an unbroken, intense stare, which actually reads as unsettling rather than confident to most people. Genuine, confident eye contact is not about intensity, it is about comfort, holding a natural gaze while someone speaks, allowing it to break away occasionally and naturally, rather than in a nervous, darting way, and returning to it with ease rather than avoidance. The goal is not to prove anything through eye contact. It is simply to remain present and engaged, which naturally produces a gaze pattern that reads as calm and grounded rather than either avoidant or aggressive. Breath is another often overlooked element, and it may be the most powerful because it directly influences your physiological state in real time. Anxiety produces shallow, rapid breathing centered high in the chest, which in turn signals to your nervous system that danger is present, reinforcing the very anxiety that caused the shallow breathing in the first place. A feedback loop that can spiral quickly if left unaddressed. Deliberately slowing your breath, breathing more fully into the lower abdomen rather than the upper chest, sends the opposite signal, calming the nervous system directly, often within seconds, which is why a few slow, deliberate breaths before a conversation you are anxious about can meaningfully shift how that conversation actually unfolds. None of these physical adjustments are about performing a false version of confidence. They are about recognizing that confidence is not purely a mental state you must somehow think your way into. It is also a physical state you can access directly. And having this second entry point available to you, alongside everything covered about mindset in earlier chapters, gives you far more tools for navigating anxious moments than relying on thought alone ever could. There is also a specific relationship between body language and the pace of your speech that deserves attention, because the two influence each other constantly. Anxious speech tends to accelerate, words tumbling out faster than intended, sentences running together without natural pauses, almost as though speaking quickly will somehow reduce the amount of time available for judgment. In reality, rushed speech tends to produce the opposite of the intended effect. It often reads as nervous rather than confident. And it also makes your words genuinely harder to follow, which can create exactly the kind of awkward moment, a confused look, a request to repeat yourself, that overthinkers fear most. Deliberately slowing your speaking pace, even slightly, allowing brief, natural pauses between thoughts, rather than filling every possible silence with rushed words, tends to produce a calmer impression almost immediately, both in how you are perceived and in how you actually feel while speaking, because slower speech is physiologically difficult to sustain while your body remains in a state of high anxiety, which means the act of consciously slowing down can itself become a tool for calming the underlying nervous system, not simply a symptom of already being calm. There is also a specific relationship between hand gestures and perceived confidence that is worth understanding, Because many overthinkers unconsciously suppress their natural hand movements out of a vague fear that gesturing too much will make them seem unpolished or overly animated. In reality, natural, moderate hand movement, while speaking, is strongly associated with perceived warmth and engagement, while completely still, rigid hands, arms held tightly against the body, or hands kept hidden in pockets, tend to read as guarded or withdrawn rather than composed. This does not mean forcing exaggerated gestures that feel unnatural. It means simply allowing your hands to move as they naturally would if you were not actively suppressing them, which for most people means a moderate amount of expressive movement that emphasizes key points without becoming distracting. Facial expression follows a similar principle. Overthinkers, particularly in anxious moments, often unconsciously flatten their facial expressions, holding a neutral, guarded look that they believe communicates composure, but actually often reads to others as distance or disinterest. Allowing your face to genuinely respond to what is being said. A small smile when something is amusing. A furrowed brow when something is genuinely thought-provoking communicates far more warmth and presence than a carefully controlled neutral expression ever could, precisely because genuine facial responsiveness signals that you are actually engaged with the conversation rather than simply managing your appearance within it. Taken together, posture, eye contact, breath, pacing, gesture, and expression form an integrated system, and the encouraging part of understanding this system is that you do not need to master all 6 elements simultaneously through effortful conscious control. Improving even 1 or 2 of these elements, most commonly posture and breath, since both are relatively easy to adjust deliberately, tends to produce a ripple effect across the others because the body operates as a connected whole rather than as isolated, independent parts. And a shift in one area of physical expression tends to naturally influence the others toward greater ease as well. There is also value in understanding how body language functions specifically during the entrance into a conversation. The first several seconds before any words are exchanged, because this window carries disproportionate weight in how the interaction that follows tends to unfold. Many overthinkers spend the moments leading up to a conversation, walking toward a group at a party, entering a meeting room, approaching someone to introduce themselves, already deep in anxious anticipation, and this anticipation shows up physically well before the first word is spoken. In a slightly hesitant gait, a hovering posture at the edge of a group, a face that has not yet settled into anything resembling ease. Learning to consciously reset your physical state in these transitional moments, taking one slow breath before entering a room, deliberately relaxing your shoulders as you approach someone, allowing your walk to remain at a natural, unhurried pace rather than a nervous scurry, can meaningfully shift the first impression you create, which in turn shifts how the other person responds to you from the very first moment, often setting a tone that continues to influence the rest of the interaction. This is not about performing confidence you do not feel. It is about recognizing that these transitional seconds are entirely within your control, regardless of how anxious the moments leading up to them may have been, and that a few seconds of conscious physical reset can meaningfully change the trajectory of everything that follows. Chapter 12. Turning nervous energy into charisma. There is a common assumption that confident, charismatic people simply do not feel nervous, that their ease in conversation comes from an absence of the anxious energy that overthinkers experience so intensely. This assumption is almost always false. Many people who appear remarkably charismatic in conversation still experience real physiological nervousness, elevated heart rate, a flutter of adrenaline, a heightened awareness of the moment. The difference is not that the nervous energy is absent. It is that they have learned to interpret and channel that same energy differently than someone who experiences it as pure threat. This distinction matters enormously because it means the goal was never to eliminate nervous energy entirely, which is an unrealistic and ultimately unnecessary target. The goal is to change your relationship to that energy so it can be used rather than simply endured. Psychologists studying performance anxiety have found something genuinely surprising. Physiologically, excitement and anxiety are almost identical states in the body. Both involve elevated heart rate, a surge of adrenaline, heightened alertness. The primary difference between the two is not what is happening in the body. It is how the mind labels and interprets those physical sensations. When you label the racing heart and heightened alertness as anxiety, your mind interprets the situation as a threat to survive. When you label those exact same physical sensations as excitement, your mind interprets the situation as an opportunity to engage with. This reframe, sometimes called anxiety reappraisal, is not a trick of positive thinking. It is a documented psychological shift with measurable effects on actual performance because the label you attach to a physiological state genuinely changes how your mind and body proceed to respond to it. Practically applying this reframe involves a simple but specific mental move. The next time you feel your heart rate rise before an important conversation, instead of thinking, "I am so nervous," try consciously thinking, "I am excited. This matters to me." This is not about denying the discomfort. The physical sensation remains exactly the same. What changes is the story your mind tells about what that sensation means, and that story has real downstream consequences for how present, articulate, and engaged you are able to be in the conversation that follows. There is also real value in recognizing that nervous energy, properly channeled, is often what other people actually experience as charisma. A completely flat, unenergized presence rarely reads as confident. It reads as disengaged. What people actually respond to in charismatic individuals is not the absence of energy but its direction. Animated expression, genuine enthusiasm, a voice that rises and falls with what is actually being said rather than remaining monotone throughout. The nervous energy you have spent years trying to suppress or hide may actually be raw material for exactly the kind of expressive, engaged presence that draws people in. Once it stops being fought against and instead gets redirected outward into genuine expressiveness, rather than inward, into anxious self-monitoring. Learning to work with this energy rather than against it is often one of the most freeing shifts available in this entire journey, because it means you do not have to wait to become a calmer, less feeling version of yourself before you can be confident. You simply have to learn to let the same energy that once fueled your anxiety instead fuel your presence. It is worth adding one important caveat here. Channeling nervous energy does not mean forcing enthusiasm you do not genuinely feel, since forced, performative energy tends to read as false almost as quickly as flat. suppressed energy reads as disengaged. The goal is not to manufacture excitement artificially. It is to stop suppressing the energy that is already naturally present and allow it to move outward through genuine expression rather than being trapped inward as anxious tension. This distinction matters because authenticity remains the foundation beneath every technique in this audiobook. No reframe or physical adjustment is meant to replace genuine presence. Each one is simply meant to remove the obstacles that have been preventing your genuine presence from coming through clearly in the first place. There is another dimension to charisma worth exploring, one that has little to do with performance and everything to do with genuine interest in other people. When most people think of charisma, they imagine someone who is exceptionally skilled at talking, someone who commands a room through the sheer force of their own words. But a significant body of observation about genuinely charismatic individuals reveals something quite different. Many of the people others describe as the most charismatic in their lives are not necessarily the best talkers in the room. They are the people who make others feel most genuinely interesting and valued in conversation with them. This reframes charisma away from something you generate entirely through your own output and towards something you create through the quality of attention you offer someone else. This is genuinely good news for overthinkers, because it means charisma is not primarily about having the wittiest response ready at all times, a standard that keeps the anxious mind in a state of constant, exhausting vigilance. It is about the willingness to make someone else feel seen, heard, and genuinely interesting, which circles directly back to the presence and active listening skills covered earlier in this audiobook. Nervous energy, once redirected outward into this kind of genuine curiosity about others, rather than inward into anxious self-evaluation, becomes not something to manage or suppress, but simply the raw fuel behind an engaged, attentive presence, the very quality that people consistently describe when asked what makes someone feel charismatic to be around. It is also worth acknowledging that this redirection of energy takes conscious practice before it becomes automatic, and that early attempts will likely feel effortful and self-conscious rather than natural, which is completely expected and not a sign that the approach is failing. Any new skill feels awkward in its early stages. The deliberate effort of catching yourself mid-anxious spiral and consciously redirecting your attention outward toward genuine curiosity about the other person will, at first, require noticeable mental effort. Over time, with repetition, this redirection becomes less effortful, eventually requiring barely any conscious thought at all. The same way any skill moves from effortful and deliberate towards smooth and automatic through sustained practice. Patience with this gradual timeline matters enormously, because many people abandon a genuinely effective approach too early, expecting immediate transformation and interpreting the natural early awkwardness as evidence that the technique does not work for them personally, when in reality, that awkwardness is simply the ordinary, universal texture of learning something new, no different from the initial clumsiness of learning any other skill worth having. Chapter 13. Building confidence through preparation without over-rehearsing. There is an important distinction between preparation that builds genuine confidence and preparation that quietly reinforces anxiety, and understanding where that line sits can transform how you approach any conversation you know is coming in advance. Whether that is a job interview, a difficult conversation with a family member, or simply attending a social event where you know you will need to introduce yourself to strangers. Healthy preparation involves clarifying your intentions and gathering relevant information, while unhealthy preparation the kind that actually increases anxiety rather than reducing it, involves attempting to script and control every possible variable in advance. An effort that inevitably fails, because real conversations are far too unpredictable to fully script, and the gap between the rehearsed version and the actual unfolding interaction often produces more anxiety than if no rehearsal had happened at all. Healthy preparation looks like clarifying, before the conversation, what you actually want to communicate or learn, without scripting the exact words you will use to get there. Before a job interview, for example, healthy preparation involves reflecting honestly on your actual experiences and what you genuinely want the interviewer to understand about you, rather than memorizing word-for-word responses to anticipated questions, because memorized responses tend to sound stiff and rehearsed. And worse, they leave you far more destabilized when a question arrives that does not match your prepared script exactly, which happens constantly in real interviews. A more effective form of preparation involves identifying a handful of core stories or points you want to convey and trusting yourself to adapt the specific wording to whatever the actual conversation calls for in the moment. This approach provides enough structure to feel grounded without demanding the kind of rigid control that inevitably breaks down against the unpredictability of real dialogue. The same principle applies to difficult personal conversations. Rather than scripting exact sentences you plan to say to a family member or partner, which often collapse the moment the other person responds in a way you did not anticipate, it is far more effective to clarify your core intention beforehand. What outcome do you actually want from this conversation? What is the one or two most important things you need the other person to understand? And then trust yourself to navigate the specific wording as the conversation actually unfolds. This kind of preparation reduces anxiety because it does not depend on the conversation going exactly according to plan in order to feel successful. It simply requires you to stay anchored to your core intention while remaining flexible about how you get there. There is also real value in preparing your physiological state rather than only your words. A few minutes of slow, deliberate breathing before a conversation you know will be challenging. A brief walk to discharge some of the nervous energy in your body. Even simply reminding yourself of past conversations that went better than you expected them to. All of these forms of preparation address the nervous system directly rather than only attempting to outthink anxiety through mental scripting alone. Confidence built through this kind of preparation tends to be far more durable than confidence built through rigid rehearsal, because it does not depend on the conversation unfolding in one specific predicted way. It depends only on your own clarity of intention and your own capacity to stay present, both of which remain available to you regardless of what the other person actually says or does. There is one more form of preparation worth naming specifically, because it operates on a longer time scale than preparing for a single upcoming conversation, and that is the cumulative preparation built through the ordinary conversations of everyday life. Every small interaction, a brief exchange with a barista, a passing comment to a neighbor, a quick check-in with a coworker, is an opportunity to practice presence, tolerance for imperfection, and comfort with silence in a genuinely low-stakes environment. Treating these small, unremarkable moments as practice, rather than dismissing them as too insignificant to matter, builds a reservoir of accumulated comfort that becomes available precisely when a higher-stakes conversation eventually arrives. This is why waiting for the important conversation to begin practicing confidence rarely works particularly well. The important conversation is simply too high pressure an environment to serve as a first attempt at a new skill. The far more effective approach treats confidence as something built primarily in the background, through the low-stakes repetition of ordinary daily life, so that by the time a genuinely important conversation arrives, the underlying skill is already present and simply needs to be applied rather than invented from scratch under pressure. There is a specific mental exercise that bridges the gap between the low-stakes practice of everyday conversation and the higher-stakes moments this preparation is ultimately meant to support. And it involves briefly, deliberately recalling past conversations that went better than expected, before entering a new anxiety-provoking interaction. Most overthinkers, when asked to reflect on their conversational history, immediately gravitate toward memories of the moments that went poorly, since those are the memories that were replayed most intensely and therefore encoded most vividly. But this selective memory creates a distorted internal record, one that suggests conversations generally go badly, when the actual, honest ratio for almost everyone is overwhelmingly weighted toward interactions that were simply fine, forgettable, or even genuinely enjoyable. Deliberately recalling a specific instance where a conversation went smoothly, where you felt at ease, where an exchange left you feeling good rather than anxious, before walking into a new, challenging interaction, helps recalibrate this distorted internal record, reminding your nervous system, through concrete evidence, rather than abstract reassurance, that positive outcomes are not just possible but statistically far more common than the anxious mind tends to assume. This is not a superficial positive thinking exercise. It is a targeted correction to a genuine memory bias that has been quietly distorting your sense of your own conversational history for years, often without your conscious awareness that the distortion was even happening. Over time, as you accumulate more evidence of conversations going well, whether through new experiences or through deliberately revisiting older ones, you may have forgotten simply because they lacked the emotional intensity of the moments that went poorly. This recalibration becomes easier and more automatic, requiring less conscious effort to access with each repetition. There is also a specific form of preparation worth mentioning that applies to conversations you know will involve a topic you feel emotionally activated by, whether that is a subject you have strong opinions on or a personal issue that tends to trigger old insecurities. In these cases, healthy preparation involves briefly checking in with yourself beforehand, noticing what specifically about the upcoming topic feels activating, and asking whether that activation is proportionate to the actual conversation ahead, or whether it is being amplified by older, unrelated experiences being unconsciously projected onto this new interaction. This kind of brief self-awareness does not require extensive analysis. Sometimes a single, honest question, "What am I actually afraid will happen here?" is enough to separate a reasonable concern from an old wound being triggered by a completely unrelated present moment. When the activation does trace back to something older, simply naming that connection to yourself, even silently, often reduces its intensity considerably. Because unnamed emotional activation tends to operate with far more force than activation that has been consciously recognized and understood. This is not about suppressing or dismissing whatever you are feeling. It is about ensuring that the intensity of your response is actually calibrated to the conversation genuinely in front of you, rather than to an entirely different conversation from years earlier that simply happens to share a similar theme or emotional texture. Chapter 14. Confidence in high-stakes conversations. Everything covered so far applies broadly across ordinary conversation, but certain situations carry an elevated intensity that deserves specific attention: job interviews, first dates, and conversations with difficult or intimidating people. These high-stakes moments tend to activate every pattern discussed throughout this audiobook simultaneously, and with far greater force: the replay loop, the fear of judgment, the perfectionism, the urge to fill silence. All of it tends to intensify precisely when the perceived consequences feel largest. Understanding how to specifically navigate these heightened moments matters, because generic confidence advice often fails to account for just how much harder these particular situations can feel. In a job interview, the core anxiety usually centers on being evaluated explicitly, which removes some of the ambiguity present in ordinary conversation and replaces it with an unmistakable awareness that you are actively being assessed. This explicit evaluation can intensify perfectionism dramatically. Since the stakes genuinely are higher in a practical sense, an interview outcome can affect your livelihood. The most useful reframe here involves remembering that an interview, despite its formal structure, is still fundamentally a conversation between two people trying to determine mutual fit, not a one-directional test you either pass or fail. The interviewer is not simply searching for flaws to disqualify you. They are trying to understand whether you would be a good addition to their team, and approaching the exchange with genuine curiosity about the role and the organization, rather than purely anxious self-monitoring about how you are coming across, tends to produce noticeably better outcomes, both because it reduces your own anxiety and because genuine engagement is something interviewers can sense and generally respond well to. First dates carry a different flavor of high-stakes anxiety, one centered less on formal evaluation and more on vulnerability, the fear of being genuinely seen and found lacking by someone you may be developing real interest in. The techniques from earlier chapters, particularly presence and active listening, become especially valuable here because a first date overloaded with anxious self-monitoring about how you are performing tends to prevent the very connection you are hoping to build. Redirecting your attention toward genuine curiosity about the other person, rather than toward anxious evaluation of your own performance, both reduces your internal anxiety and creates the kind of authentic engagement that actually fosters connection. Since connection is built through mutual presence, not through a flawless performance from either side. Conversations with difficult or intimidating people, whether a challenging boss, an aggressive family member, or someone whose personality style feels overwhelming, require an additional layer of groundedness, because these interactions often trigger not just social anxiety but a more primal sense of threat. In these situations, it helps enormously to remember that you are not required to match the other person's emotional intensity or to resolve every issue within a single conversation. Staying calm, speaking at your own natural pace, regardless of the other person's energy, and giving yourself explicit permission to pause, breathe, or even say, "Let me think about that for a moment," before responding, are all forms of quiet confidence that do not require you to feel entirely fearless. They simply require you to stay anchored to your own pace rather than being pulled entirely into someone else's. Across all three of these high-stakes situations, one underlying principle repeats itself. The intensity of the moment does not actually require a different version of you. It simply requires the same grounded presence covered throughout this audiobook, applied with a bit more deliberate effort because the surrounding pressure is genuinely higher. There is no separate, more advanced set of skills reserved specifically for high-stakes conversations that you have not already been given. There is only the consistent application of presence, tolerance for imperfection, honest communication, and physiological calm, applied a little more intentionally in moments where the stakes make that intention harder to access naturally. It is worth addressing one additional high-stakes scenario that many overthinkers find especially difficult. The conversation where you must deliver news the other person does not want to hear, whether that involves declining an invitation, ending a relationship, or providing critical feedback in a professional setting. These conversations carry a unique weight because they combine the general anxiety of social evaluation with the specific fear of causing pain or disappointment to someone else, a fear that often runs even deeper than the fear of being personally judged. Overthinkers frequently delay these conversations far longer than necessary, sometimes for weeks or months, hoping that circumstances will somehow resolve the need for the difficult conversation on their own, a hope that is rarely fulfilled, and typically only compounds the eventual discomfort when the conversation can no longer be avoided. The most effective approach to these conversations involves clarity delivered with genuine compassion, rather than clarity delivered coldly, or compassion offered instead of clarity. Many overthinkers, in an attempt to soften difficult news, bury the actual message beneath so many qualifications and cushioning statements that the other person walks away confused about what was actually being communicated, which often creates more harm than a direct, kind statement would have. Because ambiguity in these situations tends to prolong uncertainty and, ironically, prolong pain rather than reduce it. Delivering difficult news clearly, stating the core message early rather than building up to it through extensive preamble, while still remaining warm, present, and willing to sit with the other person's reaction rather than rushing to escape it, tends to be both kinder and more respectful than the alternative, because it treats the other person as someone capable of handling honest, direct communication rather than someone who must be carefully managed and protected from the full truth. There is one more high-stakes category worth briefly addressing: the group setting, where you must speak in front of multiple people at once rather than in a one-on-one exchange. Group settings often intensify overthinking because the perceived audience for any potential mistake multiplies, and the anxious mind tends to imagine every person in the room forming an equally intense judgment simultaneously. In reality, group attention is far more diffuse than it feels from the inside. Most individuals in a group setting are at least partially absorbed in their own internal experience, exactly as covered earlier regarding the spotlight effect. And this diffusion actually applies with even greater force in groups, since the total attention available is being divided across more people rather than concentrated entirely on you. A useful technique for group settings involves speaking to one person at a time within your gaze, rather than attempting to address an abstract, undifferentiated crowd, since this creates a more genuine, connected feeling both for you and for the group, who generally respond well to the sense that they are being spoken to individually rather than lectured at collectively. Pacing also matters more in group settings than in one-on-one conversation, since groups tend to have more scattered energy and attention, and speaking at a slightly slower, more deliberate pace than feels natural in a one-on-one exchange helps ensure your point lands clearly, rather than being lost in the more distracted, dispersed attention that group settings naturally create. Chapter 15. Becoming the person who never overthinks a conversation again. Throughout this audiobook, we have moved through the full architecture of conversational overthinking, why the replay loop exists, how negative filtering and mind reading distort what actually happened, why judgment feels so threatening, how perfectionism quietly sabotages the very connection it claims to protect, how identity itself can keep pulling you back toward old patterns, and a full set of practical tools: presence, tolerance for silence, ease with small talk, assertiveness, graceful recovery, confident body language, channeled nervous energy, and healthy preparation. It would be tempting to end here with a promise that if you apply everything covered, overthinking will simply disappear and never return. But that promise would not be honest. And this audiobook has tried throughout to give you truth rather than comforting fiction. The more accurate and ultimately more useful truth is this: you will very likely still overthink some conversations in the future, especially ones that matter deeply to you, because caring about connection is not a flaw to be eliminated. It is part of what makes you a thoughtful, relationally engaged person in the first place. What changes as you practice everything covered in this audiobook is not that overthinking vanishes completely. It is that overthinking stops running the show. You begin catching the pattern earlier, recognizing negative filtering as it happens rather than believing it completely, tolerating silence a little longer before panic sets in, recovering from small mistakes a little faster, speaking your honest opinion a little more often before the anxious filter can fully bury it. Confidence, understood accurately, was never about the absence of self-doubt. It was always about your relationship to that self-doubt, whether it controls you completely or whether you have learned to act alongside it, even when it is present, even when it is loud. The version of you that no longer needs this audiobook is not a version with zero anxiety. That version does not exist for anyone, including the people who appear most naturally confident in your life. The version of you that has genuinely transformed is simply someone who has built enough evidence through consistent, imperfect practice that conversations are survivable, that mistakes are recoverable, that silence is not an emergency, that your honest voice is worth using even when it shakes slightly on the way out. That evidence does not accumulate through a single dramatic breakthrough. It accumulates the same way every meaningful change accumulates, through small, repeated moments where you chose presence over performance, honesty over perfection, and forward motion over endless replay. It is worth returning one final time to something said early in this audiobook, that the goal was never to become a different person. It was always to become the version of yourself that existed underneath the years of protective overthinking. The version that speaks because there is something worth saying, not because every word has been calculated for safety first. That version of you is not waiting somewhere in the future for enough progress to be made before it can appear. It is available right now, in the next conversation, however small, however ordinary, that you choose to enter with a little more presence and a little less self-monitoring than you would have brought yesterday. You already have everything required to begin that shift. Not someday, not once every trace of anxiety has vanished, but in the very next exchange you have, wherever it happens to take place. That conversation and the one after it and the one after that are where the real transformation actually happens. Not in the understanding you have gained here, valuable as that understanding is, but in the living, breathing practice of showing up imperfectly and consistently until speaking with confidence stops feeling like something you have to work toward and simply becomes who you are. Before this audiobook closes, it is worth naming a few practical anchors you can carry forward, not as a rigid checklist to be followed perfectly, but as gentle reminders for the moments when old patterns start to resurface, because they inevitably will from time to time. When you notice yourself starting to replay a conversation, remember that the replay is not evidence of what actually happened. It is simply your nervous system running an outdated threat detection process, and you are allowed to notice that process without obeying it. When you notice the urge to fill a silence out of panic, remember that the silence belongs to both people, not to you alone, and that a few seconds of quiet rarely carries the weight your anxious mind assigns to it. When you notice perfectionism creeping into how carefully you are choosing each word, remember that connection is built through presence and authenticity, not through flawless delivery, and that the people who make others feel most at ease are rarely the ones performing the most polished version of themselves. When you make an actual mistake, remember that brief, genuine acknowledgement, followed by forward motion, serves you and the other person far better than extended apology or self-criticism. And when an old identity as the anxious one in the room tries to reassert itself, remember that identity is built through repeated evidence, not through a single belief you either have or do not have, which means every conversation where you choose presence over anxious self-monitoring is a vote cast toward the identity you are actively building, one small, ordinary moment at a time. None of these reminders require perfect execution to be valuable. You will forget them sometimes. You will fall back into old patterns on harder days, or with people who trigger old wounds more intensely than others. This is not evidence that the work has failed. It is simply evidence that you are human, engaged in an ongoing practice rather than pursuing a finished, permanent state. The measure of your progress was never going to be the complete absence of overthinking. It was always going to be your growing ability to recognize the pattern, extend yourself compassion when it appears, and return again and again to presence, to honesty, and to the simple, quiet confidence of someone who has learned, through real practice, that they can survive an imperfect conversation completely intact. That person is not someone you need to become from scratch. That person is already available to you right now in whatever conversation comes next.